Today, I would like to discuss the topic of fear. A lot of times we allow fear to be the boss in our lives. Fear can have its positives. Obviously, you can avoid certain problems because of fear. Like if you notice that you're about to fall, your fear response comes in to save you. If something's going to hit you in the street, you go, and you run away from it. So there are times when fear is very, very appropriate. And those times are not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is the crippling fears that we bring to situations ourselves. When we work any kind of magic, we recognize that the reason why magic is powerful is because there's only one power. There's only one. There's one force, there's one source, there's one substance in all the universe, and you can call it anything you want. You don't have to call it God. You don't have to call it anything. But it's the force. It is the one force. And it's neither male nor female, or it's both together, however you want to think of it. And it can present itself as male. It can present itself as female. It can present itself as multitudes. But if you understand that in its reality, it is one, and there is only oneness. Now, when we say one, we're not talking about a monotheistic deity that is outside, separate and distinct, in charge of the universe. We're talking about oneness. We're talking about there's one power, and we are all a part of that one power, and that power has within it infinite love, infinite intelligence, infinite life, infinite spirit, infinite soul, infinite truth, infinite law. It's perfect love, and there's nothing that can oppose it. There's nothing that can thwart it. There's nothing that can be against it. So any idea that there's more than one power is the source of fear. But when you recognize that the premise is incorrect, that there could be a separate power, 2 separate, 3 separate, 7 separate powers, when you recognize that that premise is incorrect, then you recognize that fear is unfounded. Because if there's only one power, then nothing can oppose it. And so one with God is a majority. Since God is for you, nothing can be against you. When you recognize that and you sit and you just be with that idea that this presence, this power, is all power. And that's what is meant by omnipotent. A lot of times what happens is we get this idea that there's evil, that there's a power of evil. There's a devil, or there's a Satan, or there is something out there, there's some sort of demon out there that is going to get us, that there's something separate and distinct from God, separate and distinct from this one power that can cause a threat. But when you recognize that there being one power, that power is invulnerable. And since you are an extension of that one power, you are invulnerable. We have within us, in this world, this ego, this part of us that is a habit of thought that we are separate and that we are alone. While it's true that we are unique and individual from God's point of view as a soul, we are not separate and distinct from God. We are not separate and distinct from the rest of creation. That would be like saying that you could separate a beam of light from the sun and that it could be out there all by itself, or that a wave in the ocean could somehow be all by itself. And you are like a wave in the ocean. You are like a beam of sun. That's who you are. So when we start thinking in terms of egotistical thinking, that's where fear is born. And it's the nature of our ego to build up reasons to be afraid. Sometimes the ego will build up these ideas as being really big and scary. They can come in the forms of disease or death or poverty or evil attack magic or hexes or demons or Satan or hell or eternal damnation. Those kinds of things. Those are the projections of our own egos. And our egos were trained to do that by other egos. But none of that comes from the one power. None of that comes from what we're going to call God in this talk. We're calling it God just because it's a universal term that most people can sort of understand. But please realize that when I'm talking about God, I'm not talking about a deity. I'm not talking about a patriarchal deity, and I'm not talking about a matriarchal deity. I'm talking about the one power. When we are plagued with any kind of fear, when we're plagued with any idea that we are vulnerable, we are confessing our belief in multiple powers. We are confessing our belief that there isn't oneness, that there isn't omnipotence, that there is multiple powers, and that those multiple powers each must be somewhat vulnerable. Another idea that many of us have is, oh, well, no, there is one power, but it doesn't take care of me. There is one power. Sure, I can deal with that. But for some reason, I'm separate from it. It doesn't care for me. I'm somehow vulnerable. And how is that possible? If there's only one, how are you excluded? Do you see how egotistical that is? I'm special. I'm separate from God, or God made a mistake with me. That's a big one, right? God made a huge mistake with me. I'm somehow defective. I'm vulnerable. I'm at the effect of other powers. I'm not like anything else God created. That's a type of an egotistical thought. In magic, we recognize the reason why our circumstances are plastic and malleable and changeable is because the screen of space is nothing but that, a screen onto which we project images, and that our lives are images that we are projecting from our minds. And those images are three-dimensional, and they include all of our senses. So any painful experiences we're experiencing, any pleasurable experiences we are experiencing, anything in this world that we are experiencing is a byproduct of a projection from our minds. Now, when we project from our minds by rote, we get what we get by rote. And that means that we are projecting onto the screen of space everything that we have been habitually taught to project by our parents, by our upbringing, by generations prior to us, by the habitual thought patterns of our ego mind. And the ego is something that's been around in this time-space continuum since the beginning of time. Because time started when we decided we were separate, when we decided that we were separate from our Creator. When we decided that there was more than one power, it's when we decided that we would want to be separate. And so that's when time, as we understand it, began. Because that's the only way to have three-dimensional experiences, is to have them within time. 3 dimensions must exist within time. Otherwise, they can't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so everything in this world, thusly, is subject to death. And that's something that we are very afraid of. We're afraid that things die. We're afraid that things are not permanent here. We're afraid that our bodies are seemingly very vulnerable to disease, to attack, to accidents, to all manner of problems. And the idea that we are bodies is another projection of our egos. The idea that we are bodies. We have it pretty airtight because we're brilliant. We're geniuses. Because remember, we are extensions of infinite intelligence. So doesn't it make sense that when we decided to create separate identities, we did that in an ingenious way, in an ingenious manner? So all of our experiences here prove to us the belief that we are finite, we are separate, we are subject to death, we are vulnerable. Because we don't have anything that points to who we are as souls or as eternal beings here. Because when we create something, because we are godlike, we do it in a way that's airtight. And here we have it. But once you recognize that everything in your life is a projection of your mind, then you can understand that by definition, this world is illusory. It's not real from the point of view of spirit. Now, please understand that we don't mean that the three-dimensional world and your life within it is not real within your experience of it. Of course it is. Of course you have pain. Of course you have problems. Of course there are diseases. Of course there are issues here. And we're not saying, oh, well, it's just an illusion, so just don't worry about it. Of course those things are real. But until you understand that ultimately they are illusions, then you are constantly at the effect of those things and cannot be their master. Once you recognize, however, that this three-dimensional universe is a construct and a projection of illusions, then you come to understand that you do have power. You have ultimate power over every aspect of your life. And that's what the study of magic is about, is to learn how to have power over your life. The ego takes that idea of power over its life, and it has its own type of magic. And it uses those ideas to create more fearful experiences. Whereas when we allow the spirit to be in charge rather than our ego mind, the spirit simply starts to put things into perspective for us. Simply starts to put things into perspective. Yes, in this moment in time, we are experiencing a three-dimensional universe, and it appears that we have these problems. However, we know that they are illusory. There is a power and an intelligence that has the solution to whatever this problem seems to be, if we but allow it to be so. If we but allow it to be so, rather than going in and trying to fix it ourselves. That's where the difference between an ego-based magical system and a spirit-based magical system is. Some people call it high magic and low magic. I don't love those terms because they don't really express it properly. But if your magic is ego-based, then you can expect more problems and more fear. Whereas if your magic is spirit-based, you can expect more healing and less fear. Once you recognize that spirit is in charge of everything and that spirit is invulnerable, then you recognize that you have nothing to fear. Nothing can hurt you. Nothing can harm you. Remember that it's the nature of your ego to build up bugaboos, to build up scary things. That's your ego's job. Is to keep you as scared and as frightened and as paralyzed as possible. Why? So that you don't do anything about it. So that you can stay in the illusion, in this pseudo kingdom that's created for you. So when you're think about what you're afraid of. What are you afraid of? You're afraid of dying. You're afraid of a disease. You're afraid of black magic. You're afraid of hexes. You're afraid of accidents. Some of you are afraid of success. You're afraid of losing your money. What are the things that you're afraid of? You're afraid of eternal hellfire and damnation. And what are the things that we have bought as egos from other egos and just taken for granted that this world is a world of fear? Always your ego will find something to be afraid of. Always, it will try to prove to you that you have a lot to be afraid of, and it does that to keep you paralyzed. Even when somebody starts to come to the point of view of like, oh, okay, well, maybe there isn't some big Satan out there that's going to get me. Maybe that's not true, and you decide that that's not true, and you move beyond that. It'll come up with something else. Just because you decide, well, I'm atheist now, so I don't believe in any of that. That's okay. The ego will say, oh, good. There's something to fear in atheism then. Well, there's something to fear in Christianity. There's something to fear in whatever it is. It doesn't matter. It can come up with a reason to be afraid. As long as you're afraid, it's doing its job, because then you're paralyzed. Now, how is that God's will? How is it the will of infinite intelligence and perfect love for you to have fear, to live in a world of fear? It's not. It's not God's will for you to be afraid. That is not divine will for you to be afraid. And just knowing that, just repeating that to yourself when you're afraid of something, if I'm afraid of something, then God didn't make it. God didn't ask for me to be afraid. God didn't say that it was time to be afraid. Now, in the Psalms, it talks about the fear of the Lord or the fear of God. That's different. That's different. The fear of God is fear that has no pain. It's the only way that you can use that energy of fear in a positive way, because the fear of God simply means respect. The fear of God simply means respecting the power and recognizing who you are in relationship to that power. And being afraid in that regard, there's no pain attached to that fear because God doesn't make pain. And that fear, it shows up as ecstasy. As ecstasy. The fear of God is pure ecstasy. Anything else that you're afraid of in the world is not ecstatic. It's painful. It's like how we say anything that you make a god in this world that's not God turns you into its slave. Anything that you're afraid of that's not God brings pain. Because when you are afraid of God, it's not fear as we understand it in this world. When you're afraid of God, it means that you are an ecstatic expression of perfection. That's what that means. So remind yourself anytime you're afraid that that's not God's will. God does not will that you be afraid. Now, when a child is afraid of something, when the child is afraid of the dark, any child is afraid of the dark, of those figures under, the shadows or monsters under the bed or things like that, we think, we can allay those fears, we can show them the truth and the reality. Well, that's what Spirit can do for you as well, because it's simply a new form of childish fear that you've grown up and convinced yourself that it's an adult way to be afraid. It's the same thing. So Spirit can, in the same way that we can allay a child's fear, can allay our fears, can get rid of our fears, can soothe our fears by showing us simply the truth. Simply showing us the truth in regards to whatever it is that we're afraid of. And so when you allow yourself to recognize your fears and call on that power to show you the truth, and remind yourself there is nothing to fear. No matter what, there is nothing to fear. When you do that, you start to recognize who you are as a spiritual master in this world. There's absolutely nothing in this world for you to be afraid of. You are not here to be victimized by anything, any person, anything. That's not your role in this world. Your role in this world is to be a master over this world. And the only way to do that is not by puffing up your ego more. It's by allowing yourself to exist as you are and recognize who you are. And that's an extension of absolute divinity and perfection. And just like that sunbeam doesn't have any reason to be afraid, there's nothing that's going to hurt that sunbeam. No matter what is around it, there's nothing that can hurt that sunbeam. There's nothing that can hurt you. Nothing can hurt you. The light that scatters away all shadows is love. That's what love is. That's divine love. That's perfect love. And that's why in the New Testament it says perfect love casts out all fear. It casts it out because it shines it away. That's all. It just shines it away. There's no battle. When you turn a light on in a dark room, it's not a big battle between dark and light. There's no war. And the same thing goes with any fear. When you turn on the light of truth, that fear must disappear. It's not because you're battling good over evil or light over darkness. You're just recognizing truth, and illusions and lies and falseness can't stand up in the presence of truth. So of course, in the moment, it seems like these things are real. Of course, in this world, it seems like these things are real. And it does take great courage, and it does take great conviction and faith to be able to stand up to those things and say, you're not what I think you are. And that maybe me as a body and me as an ego, maybe I'm vulnerable to you, but spirit is a different story. And in truth, I am an extension of spirit, not an extension of a body. I'm not an extension of a personality. I'm not an extension of an ego. I'm an extension of light. I am literally light in extension, and I am invulnerable. to anything and everything that is presented to me in this world of darkness. And I know that this is true, and I'm going to claim that this is true. And I call upon who I am as a soul to shine away all darkness. And that is what perfect love is. Perfect love is purity, is light. It's who you are at your core. No matter how bad of a person you think you might be, no matter what you think you've done in the past, no matter anything, any reasons that your ego can come up with that you don't deserve to have that kind of safety, that you don't deserve to have that kind of protection, that you don't deserve to know who you are as a soul. No matter what you can come up with, none of it stands up against the truth. Because if God didn't create it, it doesn't exist. And you have to remind yourself of that, about yourself as in your past and the things that you think you may have done and things that you think may be happening to you. If God didn't create it, it can't ultimately exist. And if you can tie yourself to that thought, then you can project that thought onto the situation. And it's not something that you have to learn how to do technically. You don't have to learn how to project it. You project naturally. You were created as a projector. That's who you are. That's just natural for you. So if you can take care of the thoughts, the projection will take care of itself. You don't have to learn how to do that. Look at how good you do it, how well you do it already. Look at how well you project things already. I do that all the time for myself. If I'm having a big problem or something like that, I think, "Ooh, look at how powerful I am. I messed that up. Great." And so now imagine how well I can do if I think Spirit's thoughts instead of thinking the fearful thoughts that I was thinking to get me into this jam, right? So just play that game with yourself. If I made it bad, Spirit can make it good because the projector is just as good depending on what film you put in there. So instead of deciding what film to put in there, ask Spirit. Ask Spirit for it. Spirit, what would you see instead of this? Spirit, what would you have me see instead of this? What would you have me feel instead of this? How would you have me behave in this situation? And when you ask that, when you sincerely ask that one power allow itself to shine through you in any situation, it will do it because its nature is responsiveness. It's not going to say no because you're somehow special, that you're the one sunbeam that can't shine. It's not going to say no to you. So ultimately, you have nothing to fear. Now, again, we're not saying that you should be unwise and not take care in this world. But with whatever you're doing in this world, if you start to carry the thought of Spirit and ask Spirit to shine away the darkness in any situation, you will recognize who you are as an invulnerable spirit rather than as a vulnerable body or a vulnerable ego, and allow Spirit to start taking charge of the thoughts in your mind instead of your ego, and you'll start to see that you truly have nothing to fear. Thank you so much for spending a little time with me. I so appreciate you, and I look forward to the next time that we are together. Until then, blessed be.